Hello and welcome to the next lecture in the NPTEL course Machine Learning for Core Engineering Disciplines. Over the last several lectures and tutorials, we have finished learning about simple ML models like linear regression, lasso and ridge regression. Right? We have also learned important concepts like cross validation and hyperparameter tuning, as well as a plethora of loss functions that can be used to tune ML models. In today's lecture, what we will do is we will start talking about unsupervised learning, right. So, before we go on to study more complex ML models like gradient boosted decision trees, neural networks, support vector machine and Gaussian process regression, it is imperative that we develop an understanding of what unsupervised learning is, so we can use it for things like dimensionality reduction as well as clustering, which is important. So, let us go ahead and dive into unsupervised learning. So, to make you recall unsupervised learning and I will define this again, although you may know it, is the use of ML to understand the underlying patterns and structure in the data set, right, without involving specific target variables or labeled data. As you remember, when we do supervised learning, you have to provide labeled data to the ML model. So, you have to tell for every data point, right, when you have a feature vector x, what is the output y that you want, whether it is a class label or it is the label of a continuous variable, in which case it is a regression problem. However, when you do unsupervised learning, I want to remind you that there is no label data, you just want to understand the structure of the underlying data set. So, how can this be done and what are the algorithms that are available to carry out unsupervised learning? So, if you look at the main classes of algorithms, they are of two types, and one of them is basically clustering, the other is dimensionality reduction. Okay. So, in clustering, what you do is you group data into clusters based on similarity, whereas in dimensionality reduction you reduce the data complexity while retaining the important data structure. So, these are the two types of algorithms that are mostly used, and some examples of clustering algorithm are k means or k medoid clustering, Then there is density based clustering, which is shortened to DBSCAN, and there are things like hierarchical clustering. When you come to dimensionality reduction, the kind of available algorithms are, say, the principal component analysis, which is shortened to PCA, and other types of algorithms like T distributed stochastic neighbor embedding, TSNE, UMAP, uniform manifold approximation and projection, as well as things like autoencoders. Okay. So, in this video and in some of the subsequent videos, we will learn why these algorithms are useful and how they can be used, right, for your particular ML problems. Now, I encouraged you to think about your specific engineering disciplines. What are the kinds of problems in which you would want to understand the data structure, right, or you want to reduce the dimensionality, and the requirements may be immediately clear to you. For example, what are the most important features that can be used to predict, for example, the activity of a catalyst material, or the most important features that determine the structural integrity of a building, right, that will lead you to dimensionality reduction. On the other hand, in clustering, you may want to find examples of drug molecules that are similar to each other or different to each other, or examples of operating conditions that lead to very high efficiencies of a process, or examples of manufacturing practices that lead to uninterrupted performance, right, when you are manufacturing a particular component. So, those are the kinds of things that you may want to think about. Our discussion here will be limited to how these algorithms work and why you may want to use them. Okay. So, let us go ahead and get started, and to introduce simpler concepts first and more complicated concepts later, we will start our journey into unsupervised learning by looking at dimensionality reduction. And first we will talk about the simplest possible dimensionality reduction technique, which comes from actually matrices and vectors, and that is called principal component analysis. So, let us go ahead and think about what is principal component analysis and why it is used. So, the topic now is principal component analysis. Okay, and it is shortened as PCA, and there is the related topic of singular value decomposition, right, that is important in linear algebra, and we will understand what singular value decomposition means. So, principal component analysis is basically a method for linear dimensionality reduction. Okay, and essentially the goal is to reduce the dimensionality, right, reduce the number of features by combining them linearly while retaining as much variance as possible, right. So, if you had for example 100 features, right, in your data set and you only want to work with 5 of them, right, without sort of sacrificing the information contained in any of them, the way to do that is principal component analysis, because it allows you to combine the features linearly and thus reduce the number of features. Okay. So, how does principal component analysis work and what is its meaning? So, to understand the meaning of principal component analysis, we sort of stress, right, or focus on the phrase principal component, right. So, what does that mean? The word principal by itself means main, right. So, we are looking at the main components, right, or the main directions in which the data set is varying a lot. So, what PCA does is that PCA finds the direction along which maximum variance exists and this is called the first principal component. That is shortened to PC, right, in p dimensional space. Okay, so, you have p features, right. So, therefore, you exist in a p dimensional space. Remember there are no target variables here, right. So, that is the space of your variables, right. So, these variables can include your features as well as your target variables, but it is not labeled in the sense that you are not wanting to predict the target variable. Okay. So, PCA finds this first principal component, right. So, once the first principal component has been determined, which is the direction of maximum variance in the data set, then you go and find the second principal component, right. So, it is the way to understand or visualize it is sequentially, although you will see that when it is implemented you do not have to go one by one, all the principal components will come to you at once. However, when you are understanding how it works, then it is good to understand the procedure sequentially, right. So, once the first principal component has been obtained, then it obtains the second principal component perpendicular or orthogonal to the first principal component for the direction with the next highest variance. Okay. So, it obtains the second principal component perpendicular to the first principal component using the direction with the next highest variance, right, and this procedure keeps going on and on and on till you have found all the principal components, right. So, in practice you get everything at once, but in principle, right, the next principal components can be determined. So, subsequently the third, fourth, right, and so on principal components can be determined. Okay. So, what is the use of this, right? Why are we doing all this? The utility is that we can visualize high dimensional data in few dimensions. Right. So, once you get the principal components PC1, PC2 and PC3 and so on, you can plot PC1 versus PC2 or PC1 versus PC3 and try to understand what is the relationship between the data points, between those features, right, in terms of the data points. So, you can visualize high dimensional data in a few dimensions. The other thing is it is useful to remove noise and redundant features. Thus leading to simpler ML models. And preventing overfitting. By training ML models, right, and these can be supervised ML models using, right, a subset of the principal components, right. So, instead of training the ML model using all the features, right, you use a subset of the principal components and thereby you have reduced the model complexity, you get simpler ML models and you prevent overfitting, right. So, that is a very good advantage, right. In addition to the first advantage, which was that it allows you to visualize, right, high dimensional data in fewer dimensions, right. So, I hope you understand why principal component analysis is so beneficial in machine learning when you are working with such high dimensional data. Okay. So, how is this principal component analysis done, right? Mathematically, right, it can be shown that you just have to carry out what is called eigenvalue decomposition of the covariance matrix, right. So, PCA is carried out by determining the eigenvalues and eigenvectors of the covariance matrix after zeroing the mean of each feature and scaling each features feature to obtain unit variance, right. So, you have scaled every feature so that you get unit variance and you have shifted, right, each feature so that you get zero mean for every feature, right. So, this is standardization of the data. So, after the data matrix, which we have been denoting so far by X, right. So, the rows of X are the features, rows of X are the data points and the columns of X are the features. So, after the data matrix is standardized, right, we can compute the covariance matrix, and this was derived in one of the previous lectures, is basically 1 over n minus 1 sum over the data points I going from 1 to n xi vector. So, the data vector minus the vector of sample means, that is x bar vector, transposed times xi vector minus x bar vector, right. So, this is the way to obtain the entire covariance matrix. Now, the good thing, right, that we have done by data standardization is that we have zeroed the mean of every feature. So, the mean of every feature is 0, that means that this vector of sample means that will be 0, right. So, what you get is 1 over n minus 1 sum I going from 1 to n xi vector transpose times xi vector, and this in matrix notation is simply x transpose x. Okay, so, it is the covariance matrix of x after standardization is just 1 divided by n minus 1 multiplied by x transpose x, right. So, in PCA what we are doing is we are determining the eigenvalues and eigenvectors of this particular matrix, right, of the covariance matrix. Okay, that is all we are doing, and this does the magic for us, right. It finds the directions which are those of maximum variation. Okay. So, we find the eigenvalues lambda and the eigenvectors v of covariance of x, right. So, you know the defining equation for eigenvalues and eigenvector. So, that is the matrix times the eigenvector equals the eigenvalue times the same vector, right. So, if lambda is the eigenvector and lambda is the eigenvalue and v is the eigenvector, then for a matrix A you say that AV equal to lambda v, and that is the same thing we are doing with the covariance matrix. So, this gives you the eigenvectors v and the eigenvalues lambda. So, how are these useful? These are extremely useful because the eigenvectors they are essentially the principal components, which is basically the direction of maximum variance. Right. So, these eigenvectors are the principal components, but how do you find out which one is the first principal component, which one is the second principal component, which one is the third principal component, and so on and so forth? That is done through the eigenvalues. So, these eigenvalues they tell you the extent of data variance, right, along each principal component or PC. So, then what this implies is that the highest eigenvalue eigenvector, that is the first principal component. The second highest eigenvalue, its eigenvector corresponds to the second principal component, and so on and so forth, right. So, this will give you all the principal components as desired. Alright. So, once the principal components are obtained, you can transform your data into the space of principal components. Now, why is that important? Because like I said, once you have done principal component analysis, you may want to develop a supervised machine learning model using the principal components. So, obviously it is important to project whatever data we want into the principal component space. So, how is this done? Let us go ahead and take a look at that. So, we want to project the data into the principal component space, and this is done through the equation z equals x times w, right, where w is the matrix of eigenvectors, right, the chosen principal components. So, you may want to work with, let us say, the top k principal components. X is of course the matrix of data. You know that there are n rows, right, n data points and p features. So, that is n by p. The matrix of eigenvectors will be of size p by k, right. If you are choosing only k eigenvectors, each column is an eigenvector, right. So, you will have k columns, but you will have p rows, right, because each of the eigenvectors principal component will have p entries, and this z, right, which will be of dimension n by k, is basically the matrix of data in the principal component space, in the PC space, right. So, thus, right, what did you start with? You started with a n by p matrix, right. You had p features, but you finish with only k features, right. So, this is what is allowing you to do dimensionality reduction, right. So, the p features right, you have been able to collapse into k principal components, right, and you can now develop a supervised ML model that works on these k principal components, and your new data matrix becomes the z matrix, right. So, this is how you can use the principal component analysis to your benefit, right. So, the next thing that we have to discuss is how singular value decomposition enters into the picture, right. I had mentioned that there is a link between principal component analysis and singular value decomposition, but to learn that we will have to wait until the next lecture. So, briefly I will recap what we did today. We introduced again the concept of unsupervised learning, wherein there are no target variables. You do not want to predict a class or a continuous variable, rather what you just want to do is you want to understand the underlying structure in the data set, and this is done by either clustering algorithms or via dimensionality reduction algorithms. We discussed how the principal component analysis works, how it is just eigenvalue decomposition of the covariance matrix 1 divided by n minus 1 times x transpose x. We discussed that the highest eigenvalue of that particular matrix corresponds to the first principal component, the second highest eigenvalue to the second principal component eigenvector, and so on and so forth. We also discussed that if we have a data matrix, how can we transform it from the original feature space to the feature space provided by the kth or k of the principal components, right. So, I hope you found the content here useful. Thank you for joining in, and see you next time.